On the morning of September 11, 2001, the world witnessed an unprecedented act of terror that shook the United States to its core. Two commercial airplanes, hijacked mid-flight, crashed into the north and south towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. Within just 102 minutes, both towers collapsed, killing nearly 3,000 people and injuring thousands more. But beyond the smoke, fire, and rubble, questions began to emerge. Questions that continue to divide opinion even today. How did the attackers manage to slip through America's security system? Why did multiple intelligence agencies fail to act on key warnings? And what explains the sudden, symmetrical collapse of these massive skyscrapers? In this video, we dig deep into the events of 9/11, not just the horrifying attack itself, but the people, politics, and policies behind it. From the official story to the lingering doubts, from the devastation to the global consequences, we ask the pressing question: what really happened on 9/11? The day the world changed. September 11th, 2001 began like any other Tuesday morning. The skies over the northeastern United States were clear, and millions of Americans were starting their day. But by 8:46 a.m., everything changed. At that moment, American Airlines Flight 11, hijacked after takeoff from Boston, slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Many assumed it was a tragic accident, until at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower with terrifying precision. The realization set in: this was no accident. America was under attack. Chaos erupted across New York City and the nation. Just 34 minutes later, at 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense. Less than 30 minutes after that, United Airlines Flight 93, possibly headed for the White House or Capitol, was brought down by brave passengers in a Pennsylvania field after a struggle with the hijackers. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower followed. In less than 2 hours, two of the tallest buildings in the world were reduced to rubble. Dense clouds of dust blanketed lower Manhattan. Emergency responders rushed in, many never to return. Nearly 3,000 people were killed that day, making it the deadliest terrorist attack in world history. But beyond the horrific death toll, the psychological impact was just as devastating. America, long considered untouchable on its own soil, was suddenly vulnerable. The events of 9/11 marked the beginning of a new era, one defined by fear, suspicion, global conflict, and a profound shift in the balance between security and liberty. It was, without question, the day the world changed. The mastermind behind the attack. In the aftermath of 9/11, one name quickly rose to the top of the global spotlight: Osama bin Laden. Born in Saudi Arabia in 1957 to a wealthy and influential family, bin Laden became deeply radicalized during the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s. He joined the Mujahideen resistance and, over time, built a powerful network of fighters and supporters. That network would evolve into Al-Qaeda, a militant Islamist group with a singular goal: to expel Western influence from the Muslim world and to strike at what bin Laden viewed as symbols of American oppression and imperialism. Bin Laden believed the United States had desecrated Islamic lands, especially by stationing troops in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War. He cited American support for Israel and US-led sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s as further justifications for war. In a series of fatwas and public declarations, he framed his mission as a religious duty: to defend Islam through violent jihad. But 9/11 wasn't Al-Qaeda's first act of terror against American targets. In 1998, the group orchestrated simultaneous bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing over 200 people. In 2000, they carried out a deadly suicide attack on the USS Cole, a naval destroyer docked in Yemen, killing 17 sailors. Despite these attacks, bin Laden remained at large and continued to expand his global terror network. Planning for the 9/11 operation began as early as 1999. Bin Laden worked closely with his top deputy, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the alleged architect of the attack. They trained the hijackers, 19 men, most of them from Saudi Arabia, with a plan that was both sophisticated and horrifyingly simple: use commercial airplanes as weapons. These men lived in the United States for months before the attack, taking flying lessons, scouting airports, and coordinating across states. The entire plot relied on surprise, coordination, and psychological impact, and it succeeded on a scale few could have imagined. Bin Laden later admitted responsibility in a videotaped message, calling the attack a retaliation against decades of U.S. aggression. While many in the West saw him as a terrorist, in some radical circles he was viewed as a hero fighting a holy war. This ideology of violent extremism, nurtured and broadcast through Al-Qaeda's global network, would ignite a chain of conflicts that continue to shape world affairs today. But it all began with one man's vision and the decision to strike fear into the heart of a superpower. Security failures and red flags. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, one haunting question echoed across the world. Could it have been prevented? As investigations unfolded, it became increasingly clear that multiple warning signs were either missed, ignored, or dismissed. Long before September 11th, intelligence agencies in the United States and abroad had picked up clues that Al-Qaeda was planning something big. As early as 1995, Philippine authorities uncovered a plot called Operation Bojinka, devised by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the same man who would later help plan 9/11. The plan involved using hijacked airliners as bombs. The CIA had access to this information, but it was not treated with urgency. Between 1998 and 2001, U.S. intelligence agencies issued dozens of warnings about potential Al-Qaeda attacks, often involving aircraft. A particularly notable warning came in the summer of 2001. On August 6, President George W. Bush received a now infamous presidential daily brief titled Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S. The memo explicitly mentioned the possibility of hijackings and cited FBI investigations into suspicious activity by individuals connected to bin Laden, yet no drastic action followed. One of the most alarming missed opportunities was the Phoenix memo, sent by FBI agent Kenneth Williams in July 2001. The memo warned of a large number of Middle Eastern men attending U.S. flight schools and urged a nationwide investigation. It was largely ignored by FBI leadership. Meanwhile, in Minneapolis, another FBI agent had arrested Zacharias Moussaoui, a French citizen of Moroccan descent, who was acting suspiciously at a flight school. He had no commercial pilot's license and seemed disinterested in learning how to land. Local agents requested a warrant to search his laptop, believing he could be part of a terrorist plot. The request was denied due to lack of evidence. Even the CIA and FBI, two of America's most powerful intelligence agencies, were failing to share crucial information with one another. In 2000, the CIA had been tracking two known Al-Qaeda operatives, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihtar, yet that information was not passed to the FBI. Both men would later board Flight 77 and crash it into the Pentagon. At the same time, airport security systems were woefully underprepared for the threat. In 2001, airline security was mostly privatized, and airport screeners were poorly trained and poorly paid. Cockpit doors were not reinforced, and there were no air marshals on board most flights. The hijackers smuggled box cutters and small blades, legal under FAA regulations, onto the planes with ease. The 9/11 Commission, established to investigate the attacks, later concluded that the attacks were a result of a failure of imagination. The report stated that the threat of terrorism had been known, but the specific possibility of a coordinated suicide hijacking campaign using passenger jets was not properly anticipated. But critics argue that it wasn't just a failure of imagination. It was a systemic failure of communication, responsibility, and accountability at the highest levels. Some even suggest that key officials turned a blind eye to the warnings because of bureaucratic inertia, disbelief, or darker motives. In the end, 19 hijackers managed to outmaneuver the most powerful intelligence apparatus in the world, not through technological superiority, but by exploiting holes in a fractured system. The question remains, if all the warnings had been acted upon, could 9/11 have been stopped? How the towers collapsed. The collapse of the Twin Towers remains one of the most visually and emotionally devastating events ever captured on camera. Within less than 2 hours of being struck, both 110-story towers of the World Trade Center had crumbled to the ground. For many, it was unthinkable. Skyscrapers had burned before, but never had they collapsed entirely. So, what caused this catastrophic failure? The official explanation came from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, after a 3-year investigation. According to their report, the towers fell due to a combination of structural damage from the airplane impacts and intense fires fueled by jet fuel. When the planes struck, they severed numerous steel columns and dislodged fireproofing material designed to protect the building's steel core. Jet fuel from the planes ignited massive fires across multiple floors. The steel framework, exposed to temperatures of up to 1,800 degrees, 982 degrees, began to weaken. Although steel doesn't melt at these temperatures, it loses about 50% of its strength at around 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit and up to 90% at higher temperatures. NIST concluded that once critical steel components, particularly in the floor trusses, failed, entire floors began to collapse. This led to a pancake effect, where each falling floor added weight and momentum, ultimately crushing the structure beneath in a rapid chain reaction. But this explanation, while scientifically grounded, hasn't convinced everyone. Skeptics and independent researchers have pointed out several inconsistencies. For one, the near free-fall speed at which the towers fell, particularly World Trade Center 7, which was not struck by a plane, has raised doubts. Some experts argue that the symmetrical and sudden collapse of the towers resembles a controlled demolition rather than a fire-induced failure. Videos show the towers disintegrating into dust mid-air, with large horizontal ejections of debris, phenomena some associate with explosive forces. Architects, engineers, and former demolition experts in groups like Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth have questioned how fire alone could bring down such massive steel structures so uniformly, especially when no steel frame high-rise had ever collapsed from fire before or since. One of the most controversial aspects is World Trade Center Building 7, a 47-story skyscraper that fell at 5:20 p.m. on the same day, despite not being hit by a plane. The NIST report attributes its fall to office fires ignited by debris from the nearby Twin Towers. However, critics argue that its sudden, symmetrical collapse, straight down into its own footprint, bears striking resemblance to a pre-planned demolition. Adding to the suspicion is the speed of the collapses. The North and South Towers each fell in about 10 to 12 seconds, nearly the same time it would take for an object to fall freely from that height. This has led some physicists and engineers to argue that resistance from intact lower floors should have slowed the collapse considerably. NIST has denied these claims, asserting that the structural damage and fire-induced weakening were sufficient to explain the collapses without the need for explosives. But they have also admitted that no search for explosives was ever conducted, further fueling skepticism. In the end, while the official narrative emphasizes fire, structural damage, and engineering failure, the visual evidence and unresolved anomalies continue to stir debate. For many, the collapse of the Twin Towers is not just a physical event, it's a symbol of deeper uncertainties and a catalyst for questions that still demand answers. Aftermath, War on Terror, and Global Impact. The attacks on September 11, 2001 not only changed the course of American history, but also redefined global geopolitics, leading to the emergence of a new era, the War on Terror. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, there was an overwhelming sense of unity and patriotism within the United States. The country, stunned and grieving, rallied around the government's response to the atrocities. The slogan, "Never Forget," became a rallying cry, while political leaders vowed to bring those responsible to justice. But the official response quickly escalated far beyond retribution. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the U.S. launched Operation Enduring Freedom, an invasion of Afghanistan aimed at dismantling the Taliban regime and eliminating Al-Qaeda's safe havens. The decision was framed as part of a broader, long-term fight against global terrorism. In Afghanistan, American forces swiftly ousted the Taliban from power and crippled Al-Qaeda's infrastructure. But despite early successes, the situation in Afghanistan grew increasingly complex. The Taliban, though defeated in major cities, retreated to the countryside and began a lengthy insurgency that would drag on for years. But it wasn't just Afghanistan. The war on terror quickly expanded to other parts of the world, most notably to Iraq. In 2003, under President George W. Bush, the U.S. launched an invasion of Iraq based on the claim that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and posed a threat to international security. Despite the absence of any tangible evidence linking Iraq to the 9/11 attacks, the war was framed as part of the broader campaign to eliminate terrorism. It would become one of the most controversial and destructive military actions of the 21st century. The Iraq War led to widespread instability in the Middle East and contributed to the rise of violent extremist groups like ISIS, which would go on to wreak havoc across Iraq and Syria. The war also deeply divided American and global opinion, with critics accusing the Bush administration of using 9/11 as a pretext for pursuing a separate agenda in Iraq. In the U.S., the war on terror had far-reaching consequences on domestic policies. The Patriot Act, signed into law in October 2001, expanded government surveillance capabilities, allowing federal agencies like the FBI and NSA to monitor communications and gather intelligence on individuals suspected of terrorism-related activity. The law was controversial for its infringement on civil liberties, with critics arguing that it led to unwarranted surveillance, racial profiling, and violations of privacy. The Homeland Security Act created the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, a new cabinet-level agency aimed at coordinating efforts to protect the U.S. from terrorist threats. The creation of the DHS represented a massive expansion of the federal government's security infrastructure. Airports, public transportation systems, and critical infrastructure around the world became subject to heightened security measures. The TSA, Transportation Security Administration, was established to oversee airport screenings, implementing stringent security checks that are still in place today. The war on terror expanded to include a vast array of counterterrorism measures, including the use of drone strikes in countries like Yemen, Pakistan, and Somalia, raising significant ethical and legal questions about targeted killings. On the international front, the U.S. forged new alliances in the fight against terrorism, including NATO and numerous Arab and Muslim-majority countries. Yet, the war on terror also strained relationships with countries like Pakistan, whose support was crucial to the Afghanistan campaign, but whose own internal struggles with extremism complicated U.S. efforts. The long-term consequences of the war on terror are still unfolding. The U.S. military's involvement in the Middle East has lasted for more than 2 decades, costing trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives. The political and social ramifications are still felt across the world, from the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment to the controversial use of torture and indefinite detention at facilities like Guantanamo Bay. For many in the Middle East, the legacy of 9/11 and the subsequent wars has been one of destruction, instability, and suffering. Countries like Iraq and Afghanistan continue to grapple with the consequences of foreign intervention and the spread of extremism. The humanitarian costs have been staggering, with millions of people displaced and untold numbers of civilians killed in the crossfire. But beyond the battlefield, the impact of 9/11 on global politics cannot be overstated. The event reshaped international relations, with nations focusing more heavily on security concerns and counter-terrorism strategies. International law was tested and often bent to accommodate the rhetoric of war. The attacks on the Twin Towers set in motion a massive global response to terrorism, which continues to shape world events to this day. For the United States, the war on terror marked a shift towards a more security-focused, less liberal worldview, one in which military action, surveillance, and preventive measures became dominant tools in foreign and domestic policy. The legacy of 9/11, a changed world. As the dust settled from the wreckage of the World Trade Center, it became evident that the 9/11 attacks would leave an indelible mark not just on the United States, but on the entire world. The ramifications of that fateful day continue to unfold, affecting everything from international relations and security policies to the lives of ordinary citizens. The impact of 9/11 is woven into the very fabric of our modern world, creating a new reality in which we live. Security and surveillance. Perhaps one of the most lasting legacies of 9/11 has been the dramatic expansion of security measures, both domestically and globally. In the US, the Patriot Act, signed into law shortly after the attacks, granted sweeping powers to the federal government to monitor communications, detain suspected terrorists, and increase surveillance on both individuals and groups. Civil liberties advocates have long decried this as an erosion of privacy and personal freedoms, warning that the line between security and authoritarianism has been blurred. Airport security, once a routine and relatively simple procedure, has become a global symbol of post-9/11 life. Long lines, invasive screening procedures, and the creation of agencies like the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, have fundamentally altered the way we travel. The effects of 9/11 are still felt every time we step foot in an airport or navigate any form of public transportation. Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment. One of the more unfortunate social consequences of the 9/11 attacks has been the rise in Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment around the world. In the wake of the attacks, Muslims, both in the US and abroad, found themselves scapegoated, profiled, and demonized in ways that had not been seen before. Hate crimes against Muslims spiked, mosques were attacked, and discrimination became a harsh reality for many members of the Muslim community. The portrayal of Islam as inherently linked to terrorism has left a legacy of suspicion and mistrust, creating an environment where Muslims are often unfairly associated with extremism. This prejudice extends far beyond the US, with many Muslim-majority countries also grappling with the fallout from the West's war on terror. These societal divisions remain deeply entrenched, contributing to cultural misunderstandings and tensions that persist to this day. War on terror and global conflict. The most visible and long-lasting legacy of 9/11, of course, is the war on terror, a conflict that reshaped the geopolitical landscape. It led to military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, which not only destabilized the Middle East, but also fueled ongoing conflicts that continue to have global implications. The war on terror also marked the rise of drone warfare and the controversial use of targeted killings. Drones became a central tool in the US military's arsenal, used to eliminate high-profile targets such as terrorist leaders, but often at the cost of civilian lives. The ethics of drone strikes, particularly in countries like Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, remain highly debated, with many questioning the effectiveness and morality of such tactics. The invasion of Iraq, in particular, is widely seen as a disaster, with the country descending into chaos, sectarian violence, and the eventual rise of groups like ISIS. The effects of these wars will continue to reverberate throughout the region, as well as within Western countries, dealing with the consequences of radicalization, displaced refugees, and the spread of extremist ideologies. The rise of nationalism. One of the more insidious byproducts of the post-9/11 world has been the rise of nationalism and xenophobia across the globe. As nations have become more focused on security and protecting their borders, populist leaders have capitalized on fear, using 9/11 as a justification for anti-immigrant policies and isolationist rhetoric. The global refugee crisis, exacerbated by the conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, has seen millions of displaced people seeking refuge in Europe and the United States. However, this has sparked intense debates on immigration policy, with many leaders stoking fears of terrorism to justify stricter controls on immigration and refugee resettlement. The changing nature of warfare. 9/11 marked the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one that no longer relies solely on traditional military engagements. The rise of asymmetric warfare, in which non-state actors like Al-Qaeda engage in unconventional tactics such as terrorism, guerrilla warfare, and cyber attacks, has altered the way nations approach defense and security. The rise of cyber warfare and the proliferation of information warfare through social media platforms have added new layers of complexity to national security. The global fight against terrorism has evolved, with counterterrorism strategies now focused on disrupting terrorist networks, preventing radicalization, and engaging in diplomatic efforts. The notion of defeating an enemy state through conventional means has largely been replaced by more nuanced, covert strategies aimed at destabilizing terrorist organizations and denying them access to resources and support. Political and cultural shifts. Politically, 9/11 shifted the global balance of power. The United States, already a dominant world power, further cemented its role as the self-declared leader of the free world, and its influence expanded through the so-called War on Terror. Meanwhile, the attacks exposed vulnerabilities in the global order and prompted many nations to reevaluate their security arrangements. Culturally, 9/11 has left an enduring mark on art, literature, and media. Films, television shows, and books have continued to explore the trauma, grief, and global consequences of the attacks. The phrase, "never forget," ATS, became synonymous with remembering not just the victims, but the broader sense of loss, loss of innocence, loss of security, and loss of a sense of certainty about the world. The search for truth, the questions surrounding the events of 9/11, the unanswered doubts, the alternative theories, and the calls for transparency continue to resonate. The official narratives provided by government agencies and investigative bodies like the 9/11 Commission have been met with skepticism by many who feel the full truth has not been revealed. Whether one believes the conspiracy theories or trusts the official account, the search for the complete truth about 9/11 is still ongoing. The legacy of 9/11 is a reminder that certain moments in history are so profound that they alter the course of human civilization. The attacks marked a pivot point in world history, leading to wars, changes in political ideologies, and a reevaluation of our collective future. As we continue to navigate the world in the shadow of 9/11, we are reminded that our history is shaped by both the monumental events we experience and the questions we continue to ask about them.